Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. As voting is just starting in the Australian federal election, it's worth explaining how voting occurs for the Senate, which can be quite tricky and confusing. In this video, I'll explain a bit of the history about how Australia got the voting system that it has today at the federal level and some of the constitutional challenges that were made to it. Mostly I'll be focusing on the Senate, but there'll be a little bit on the House of Representatives where it's relevant. As explained in a previous video, the first federal elections were based on the existing electoral law in the relevant state. And this was a temporary measure, which the Constitution described as until Parliament otherwise provides. Right. So the Commonwealth Parliament did provide in 1902. Interestingly, however, the bill as initially introduced by the government provided for the alternative vote, AV, which is a form of preferential voting to apply in the House of Representatives, and the single transferable vote, STV, a system of proportional representation, to apply in the Senate. The government's aim was to try to represent, as well as it could, the wishes of the voters. However, it was opposed by quite a number of members of Parliament because they had been elected under the earlier state system and were quite worried that if you change the electoral system, they might not be elected next time. So both the proposed new voting systems were dropped and replaced with first past the post for the House of Representatives and an equivalent form of block voting for the Senate. Voters would mark a cross next to the name of the candidates that they supported equal to the number of vacancies that needed to be filled. The candidates with the greatest number of votes were elected to fill those vacancies. In 1918, the alternative vote was adopted for the House of Representatives. Why? Well, it followed a by-election where a Labor candidate won with only 35% of the vote because the non-Labor Conservative side, despite winning 65% of the vote, had its vote split amongst three different candidates. The Nationalist government of Billy Hughes realised that the splitting of its vote amongst different Conservative candidates would be its doom unless the voting system changed to a form of preferential voting, and so it did. The Senate voting system, however, proved to be more problematic. Each state operated as a single multi-member electorate. From 1919 to 1948, a form of alternative voting was used, but the effect of this particular form of voting was that one side would often win the vast majority of seats with very little representation for the other side. For example, in 1925, the Labor Party won 45% of the formal Senate votes, and the Nationalist Country Party coalition won 55%. But this translated into the Conservative side winning all 22 seats, with Labor winning 0. Now, just a side point here, you might be wondering why there were 22 seats available. Well, that was because there were 3 per state, which takes you up to 18, but in those days any casual vacancies were also filled at the next half Senate election, and there were 4 of those, which takes you to 22. Now, the reverse happened in 1943, with Labor winning 55% of the vote and all 19 seats then on offer, while the United Australia Party and the Country Party as a coalition won 0. In 1948, that was changed, with the system of proportional representation being introduced for Senate elections. It more accurately reflected the will of the voters. It meant that where a minority of voters voted for a particular party, this was more likely to be represented by an equivalent number of seats in the Senate. It also meant that minor parties and independents were more likely to be elected, and it became hard for the government to obtain majority support in the Senate. How does this voting system work? Okay, it's rather complex and it's currently set out in section 273 of the Commonwealth Electoral Act if you need to know a lot of the detail. The Australian Electoral Commission also explains that detail on its website. I'm going to give a summary here, but even that is rather complex. All right, how does it work? First thing you need to do is work out the relevant quota for the state. And that's calculated by dividing the total number of formal Senate votes by one more than the number of candidates to be elected, and then adding 1. So, in a half Senate election for 6 vacancies in a state, the quota would be 1/7 of the total number of formal votes plus 1, which is known as the Droop quota, named after the English lawyer and mathematician Henry Droop. Candidates who receive first preference votes that reach the quota are then elected. Their surplus votes are then redistributed to continuing candidates, so those who haven't been excluded from the count. Originally, it was only the surplus votes that were redistributed, but this could be unfair because it might be an unrepresentative sample. So the system was later amended in 1983 so that all the second preferences are redistributed, but with a fractional value. This means that the number of surplus votes received by candidate A is divided by the number of first preference votes received by candidate A, and that fraction then becomes what's known as the transfer value. All the first preference votes given to candidate A, which then give a second preference to, say, candidate G, are then multiplied by that fraction and then added to the first preference votes received by candidate G, and so on. Now, if that pushes candidate G over the quota, then candidate G is elected and his or her surplus is then redistributed to other continuing candidates in the same way. But if that doesn't fill all the Senate seats, then the candidate who received the lowest number of votes is excluded, and their votes are then redistributed to the next preference. So if candidate Z is excluded, his or her votes will be transferred to the next preference on the ballot with a transfer value of 1, as long as that candidate is a continuing one. It gets more complicated from there, believe it or not, but basically surpluses are distributed first, and then candidates are eliminated from the bottom up until all the seats are filled. When the system was first introduced in 1948, one difficulty for voters was that ballots only listed candidates and not their political affiliation, such as whether they belonged to a particular party. This was one of the reasons why how to vote cards were established, so that voters knew who the Liberal Party candidate was or who the Labor Party candidate was, and how the particular party wanted its voters to order their preferences. Voters were also required to number all the squares next to the names of candidates in order of their preference. This resulted in significant numbers of informal votes, particularly for the Senate, because people would muck up the numerical ordering when there were lots of candidates. In 1984, this was addressed by placing party affiliations on the ballot papers and introducing above-the-line voting for the Senate. A voter could then choose to pursue the old method of numbering all their preferences against each candidate listed below the line, which was placed in the middle of the ballot paper, or they could take the easier course of indicating their acceptance of a party ticket by marking the square for that party above the line. Voting above the line resulted in a preference flow that was determined by the political party according to a ticket that it lodged with the Australian Electoral Commission. The constitutional validity of the above-the-line and below-the-line voting system was challenged in a number of cases, including Mackenzie and the Commonwealth in 1984 and the Ditchburn case in 1999. But on both occasions, it was held to be valid. One effect of the change was to reduce the number of inadvertent informal Senate votes. It also made voting much quicker and easier, but it had the effect of shifting great power to the political parties over the allocation of preferences. Before these changes, parties had hoped that electors would follow the preferences that were marked on how to vote cards, but many of the voters wouldn't. Now, by making it easy for voters, by allowing them to mark only one box on the Senate ballot above the line for the party of their choice, the party controlled the flow of preferences. This led to complex preference deals amongst parties and increasingly to the gaming of the system. The problem was particularly notable in state upper houses, most of which used the same kind of system. In New South Wales at the 1999 election, I was working in the New South Wales Cabinet Office, and one of my responsibilities was the New South Wales Electoral Commission. By then, election to the New South Wales Upper House had become a bit of a game that almost anyone could play. People would register micro-parties with catchy names, sometimes representing even opposite sides of a political issue, and then they would funnel those preferences through these voting tickets to the person that they wanted to get elected. These party names included the 3-day weekend party, the Jobs for Everyone party, the Stop Banks Exploiting Australians party, the People Against Pedophiles party, the Give Criminals Longer Sentences party, and the Make Billionaires Pay More Tax party. The ballot paper was so large, it was known as the tablecloth ballot paper. Preference deals amongst parties were also negotiated by so-called preference whisperers to get certain people elected, even though those people might have very little popular support. However, the geniuses who were trying to exploit the system to get themselves elected stuffed up, and we ended up with Malcolm Jones from the Outdoor Recreation Party being elected with a primary vote of just 0.2% or 0.045 of a quota. Two other candidates were also elected from parties that received 1% or less of the primary vote. Now, it was clear that something had to be done to stop the madness. The reforms, which I was involved in developing and marshalling through Parliament, included requiring a party to have 750 members with no overlap of members with other parties before it could be registered. Now, if you're wondering about the rather odd number, 750, it came about because the government wanted 1,000, the opposition wanted 500, and so we just said 750, deal, and it was agreed. It was no more sophisticated than that. The most significant change, however, was to end the use of these group voting tickets that had permitted the gaming of the system. Instead, they were replaced in New South Wales with optional preferential above the line voting. This meant that if you marked 1 in a box above the line, it would allocate your preferences to all the candidates standing for that party in the order that the party had nominated and listed below the line. Then a voter had to mark 2 above the line for the next party of their preference, with the votes flowing through that party's candidates and so on. The reason for explaining what happened in New South Wales is that the Commonwealth would eventually adopt those measures. The Commonwealth had already a system in which there were registered parties and a requirement that there be 500. In 2000, however, it adopted the New South Wales requirement that there be no overlap between the party membership. The validity of that requirement was challenged in the High Court in the case of Mulholland and the Australian Electoral Commission in 2004, and it survived. The Commonwealth did not, however, immediately remove party tickets. The number of Senate candidates continued to grow, and some were elected with very little popular support. For example, in the 2013 half-Senate election, Ricky Muir of the Australian Motoring Enthusiast Party was elected with a primary vote for his party of 0.5%, but he benefited from preference flows from another 22 different parties. After the 2013 election, the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters inquired into the problem and recommended a form of optional preferential above-the-line voting, as used in New South Wales, which would eliminate party-controlled tickets. That was finally implemented at the Commonwealth level in 2016. By that stage, 95% of electors voted above the line. So political parties controlled preferences in relation to 95% of votes. But with the implementation of optional above-the-line voting, there was a concern that votes would exhaust, so they'd run out of preferences. And if a voter just put one in a box above the line, because that's what they were used to doing previously, then that might mean that their vote would exhaust very early. So the Commonwealth required that voters must put a number in at least 6 boxes above the line, although there are also some savings provisions for people who don't do that. In addition, optional preferential voting was also implemented below the line. Instead of having to fill out every single box with a number, voters for the Senate could now vote for at least 12 candidates below the line, but didn't have to vote for more. This new voting system was challenged by Senator Bob Day in Day and the Australian Electoral Officer in 2016. His general argument was that it would somehow disenfranchise 3 million voters and prevent candidates from minor parties being elected. Now, history has shown us since that time that many candidates from minor parties and independents have been elected, contrary to Senator Day's argument. In particular, Senator Day argued that there was no single uniform method of choosing senators because there were 2 different methods in above the line and below the line voting in breach of Section 9 of the Constitution. The High Court dismissed this, accepting that there was a single uniform voting system in which people could choose how to express their choice. Senator Day then argued that there was a breach of the requirement in Section 7 of the Constitution that senators be directly chosen by the people because those who vote above the line vote for parties, not individuals. The court described this argument as untenable. It noted that a vote above the line is a vote for each of the candidates of that party listed below the line. It remains a vote for a candidate, not a party. Day also contended that because voters are no longer compelled to give preferences to all candidates, their vote can exhaust and end up not electing a candidate. This was his argument about disenfranchisement. He argued that this was unconstitutional because it breached a principle of direct proportionality. The High Court said that there was no such principle of direct proportionality in the Constitution. Electors are not disenfranchised if they make a choice not to vote for more candidates and let their vote exhaust. It's a democratic choice, not the loss of a right to vote. The Senate voting system was therefore upheld as valid. What are the takeaways from all of this? First, political parties no longer control where your Senate preferences go. You control which parties they go to, whether you vote above or below the line. Second, read the instructions on the ballot paper. You may have voted many times before, but the rules do tend to change and they are different at the state and federal level. So ensure that your vote is formal by doing what the instructions say. That means that for the Senate, vote for at least 6 parties in your order of preference if you vote above the line, or at least 12 candidates if you vote below the line. Vote for more than 6 or 12 if you don't want to risk your vote becoming exhausted without electing someone. For the House of Representatives, the other thing to be very cautious about is the rules are different. Fill in preferences for all the candidates on the green ballot paper. Yes, there are some savings provisions in the electoral law, but you don't want to have to rely on them because you might get it wrong. Best to follow the instructions on the ballot paper for safety's sake. Your vote is precious. It's something that people have fought and died for. It's something that some people can only dream of. Don't disrespect all those people who struggled to give you the vote by wasting it. Finally, take your voting seriously. If you are later going to complain and say, "How did that idiot get into Parliament?" then don't vote for idiots. Learn who the candidates are and don't vote for them if you think they're not going to do a good job. It does take some effort, but it's the least you can do in return for having the benefit of living in a democracy. Thank you once again for watching the Constitutional Clarion. I hope you found this informative, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Goodbye.